Hello, my name is Steve Kaufman. I've written a book titled The Nature of Reality, What We Really Are, and the Amazing Story of How We Got Here. And the purpose of both the book and this series of videos, of which this is the second, is to tell the story of how the reality that we really are got itself into the situation that we are in. In the first video, I explained the situation that we are in, and in this video, I'm going to begin to explain exactly how we got into this situation. And as I explained in the first video, the situation that we are in is that we are a formless, uncreated, timeless, and deathless reality that has completely obscured its own reality from its awareness as a result of mistakenly believing that the physical appearances that are being produced by our minds are realities that are actually there, thereby obscuring from our awareness the reality that is actually there, or physical reality as a mind generated appearance only appears to be. And because the reality that's actually there, where physical reality appears to be, is the reality that we really are, mistakenly believing physical reality to be the reality that's actually there has the effect of obscuring from our individual awarenesses our own reality, thereby leaving our individual awarenesses effectively trapped in mind generated experiential environments where we suffer. And we suffer because while effectively trapped in those mind generated experiential environments, we have no choice but to misidentify with and so come to mistakenly know ourselves as being experiential appearances that are completely different in nature than the reality we really are, leaving us mistakenly aware of ourselves as being realities that are born and die and that can be harmed in countless ways. And as a result of that misidentification, we become and remain aware of a persistent undercurrent of both fear and incompleteness, even though the reality that we really are cannot die, cannot be harmed, and is never in any way incomplete. And so, the persistent sense of incompleteness that almost all human beings feel has as its basis the fact that we have obscured our own reality from our awareness, leaving us with the sense that something is missing. And something is missing. It's just not the something that we think is missing. Because what's missing is not some experiential thing. And that's because what's actually missing is our awareness of our own formless reality. But that lack of awareness of our own reality doesn't make the reality that we are in any way incomplete, because we're still the same uncreated, timeless, and deathless reality, regardless of what we're aware of. But that lack of awareness of our own reality does leave the reality that we really are persistently aware of the feeling that something is missing, and so leaves us with a persistent sense of incompleteness. But because we only become aware of that sense of incompleteness while effectively trapped in a mind generated experiential environment where we have mistakenly identified with various physical and mental experiential realities, it seems to us that the sense of incompleteness that we feel must be the result of something that is missing from our mind generated experiential identity, and which mind generated experiential identity we refer to as the ego. And because it seems to us that the sense of incompleteness that we feel must be the result of something that is missing from our mind generated experiential identity, and because we don't like or want that sense of incompleteness, because it's so contrary to our true nature, we spend our lives trying to fill that seeming void with various experiential realities. And it never works, at least for very long, because what seems to be missing is not what's actually missing. And that's why the sense of incompleteness always returns at some point, even after you've acquired some experiential reality of some sort that, for some relatively brief period of time, seems to fulfill you. And the sense of incompleteness always returns at some point because the thing that's actually missing and creating the sense of incompleteness is still missing, no matter what experiential reality you acquire and add to your mind generated experiential identity. And again, that's because what's actually missing and creating your sense of incompleteness is not an experiential thing, but is your awareness of your own reality. And so the only thing that can ever truly fulfill you in a way that does not fade over time is the direct awareness of the reality that you really are. But most of the individual awarenesses that are flowing through and animating human minds and bodies don't know any of that, because those individual awarenesses have no idea of what they really are or of the situation that they have placed themselves in as a result of being born human. But we're here to change that, because the ultimate purpose of both the book and this series of videos is to provide human beings with a conceptual awareness of what they really are and of the situation they are in order to make it easier for human beings to become directly aware of the reality they really are, because that is the main event. Because nothing else can free your awareness from the mind generated experiential environment in which it is, in all likelihood, effectively trapped. And so nothing else can truly put an end to the suffering that being trapped in such an environment produces. The reality that you really are is the fundamental reality out of which the entire universe is constructed and of which it is composed, beyond the physical surface appearance. And so there is no force in the universe or beyond that can compel your awareness to leave the experiential cage in which it has inadvertently and yet unavoidably trapped itself. You have to choose to do so yourself. And it is simply the case that it is much easier to make that choice once you know that such a choice even exists. Because right now, most individual awarenesses that are flowing through and animating human minds and bodies don't have any choice other than to remain effectively trapped in what are only mind generated experiential environments, completely unaware of the reality they really are. Because unless and until you become aware of the possibility of becoming directly aware of the reality you really are, so that that becomes a choice that you can make, every choice you make just ends up with your awareness still trapped in what is just a more or less pleasant form of the same experiential cage, where you will continue to suffer and remain aware of a persistent undercurrent of both fear and a sense of incompleteness. And that's why many of the people who have more money than they could spend in 1,000 lifetimes remain obsessed with getting even more and spend their lives trying to acquire even more, because more is never enough, because no experiential reality can put an end to the sense of fear and incompleteness that an individual awareness must be aware of, while that awareness remains completely unaware of its own reality, but instead remains aware of itself as some set of mind generated physical and mental experiential appearances that, as experiential appearances, are completely different in nature than the reality that it really is. The best you can do in that situation is tamp down or cover up those unwanted feelings for a while by acquiring some experiential object, either physical or mental, that for a moment seems to take away the fear and lessen the feeling of incompleteness. But again, those feelings always return sooner or later, and usually sooner rather than later, in which case we then start working on trying to acquire the next experiential object that we believe will rid us of the feeling of fear and the sense of incompleteness. Everybody wants to feel better. There's nothing wrong with wanting to feel better. Wanting to feel better is not the problem. The problem is the way we naturally and yet mistakenly go about trying to feel better while trapped in an experiential delusion, completely unaware of the reality that we really are. Because being trapped in that delusion has left almost everybody running around looking for a way to feel better that, even when that goal is achieved for some brief period of time, is only a pale imitation of what it is they are really looking for. And almost everybody is running around in an ultimately futile attempt to feel better because no one has ever told them what it is they're really looking for. And so, in case you missed it, I'll say it again directly. The thing that you're really looking for that will bring you the deep and lasting satisfaction, peace, and fulfillment that you naturally desire and that you cannot help but desire is the direct awareness of your own reality. Because that's what's actually missing from your awareness. And it's only because that's missing from your awareness that you feel a persistent undercurrent of both fear and a sense of incompleteness. And so, until you become directly aware of your own reality, those feelings are just not going to go away, at least for very long. It's also simple and easy to understand once you understand the nature of reality, what we really are, and the situation that we have placed ourselves in, none of which is all that complicated. Because beyond the appearance of the 10,000 physical and mental experiential things that make reality seem so complicated, there is just a single, indivisible, formless reality moving in relation to itself at the speed of light. And as a result of that speed of light movement in relation to itself, that formless reality structurally evolves into the series of four progressive relational structures that are actually there, where the four progressive physical realities of space, light, matter, and animated matter appear to be. Because as I mentioned in the first video, although physical reality may be just a mind-generated appearance, and so it's not the reality that's actually there, physical reality is not unrelated to the reality that is actually there, but exists as a sort of mind-generated etching of certain structural aspects of that reality. And explaining exactly how the formless reality that's actually there structurally evolves is what this particular video is about. And once you understand how that formless and fundamental reality structurally evolves, you will be able to understand how this happens. And by this, I mean how the formless and fundamental reality is able to flow through and animate relationally structured forms of itself, thereby causing those relationally structured forms of itself to appear alive for as long as that animating relation continues to operate. And once you understand how this happens, and so understand what is actually happening to produce what we perceive as animated matter or matter that appears alive, you will be able to see clearly that what we perceive as life or the life force is just the teeniest, tiniest tip of a relationally structured iceberg that is composed solely of that which is life itself, and that that unending life is the reality you really are. What that means is that, contrary to present day scientific belief, what we perceive and conceive as the animating or life force is not something that is being created by physical reality. And that's because the force that we conceive as animating what we perceive as animated or living matter is the same reality out of which all matter, all energy, and all of space is actually constructed beyond the physical surface appearance. You see, our mistakenly believing physical reality to be the reality that's actually there and the resultant obscuring of the reality that is actually there from our awareness has caused us to conceive of reality in an upside down or topsy-turvy fashion. Specifically, because we mistakenly conceive of what is actually just a secondary experiential creation as being the primary reality, we are left with no choice but to mistakenly conceive of the formless awareness or consciousness that is actually the primary reality as being a secondary reality that is in some unknown way being created by the physical reality that we mistakenly believe is the primary reality. And human beings see reality in that upside down and topsy turvy way because most of the individualized awarenesses that are flowing through and animating human minds and bodies are effectively trapped in a looking glass reality, which is to say, in a reality that is composed entirely of what are nothing more than mind generated experiential appearances that keep continuously obscured from their individual awarenesses the truly primary and fundamental reality that is both actually there and what they really are. It's a truly fascinating situation once you're able to step out of it to some degree and so see it from the outside looking in instead of just being completely stuck in it. On the other hand, while completely stuck in that situation, it does not seem fascinating at all because then it's just a pain in the ass that you keep trying to make go away or escape from. In any case, once you understand how this happens, you will also be able to understand why it eventually became necessary for the fundamental reality to evolve a mind structure in order to provide the individualized flows of awareness that are animating those structures with some information regarding the relationally structured environment in which they must operate while animating those structures. And once you understand how the formless awareness that you really are uses the mind that is flowing through and animating to produce what you are aware of as physical and mental reality, you will be able to understand why it was inevitable and unavoidable that you would become mistakenly aware of those mind generated appearances as being realities that are actually there, thereby obscuring from your awareness the reality that is actually there, and thereby obscuring from your awareness your own reality, leaving you in the situation that you are most likely in now, which is effectively trapped in a mind generated experiential environment, aware of some degree of fear and a sense of incompleteness. And once you understand the situation that you're in, it will be much easier for you to choose to become directly aware of the reality that you really are, so that you can free your awareness from the experiential cage in which it is presently, in all likelihood, effectively trapped. Now, one last thing I'm going to mention before I begin the detailed description of how an ultimately formless and fundamental reality causes all these experiential forms to happen and appear as more real and fundamental than itself is that this is the second video of what is going to be a series of videos that, taken together, will tell the full story of how the reality that we really are got itself into the situation I just described, and which full story I already told in the book. Now, if I had a business manager, which I don't, that business manager would no doubt say, but if you make a series of videos that tells the whole story that you tell in the book, then people won't have to buy the book. And I would then tell my business manager, thank you for pointing that out. And then I would go ahead and do it anyway. Because while I would love to sell a lot of books, what I would love even more is for human beings to become aware of what they really are so they can suffer a whole lot less than they are now as a result of being completely unaware of what they really are. In any case, the point I'm trying to make is that this is not a standalone video because the concepts presented in the first video establish the context for the concepts that will be presented in this video. And as I stated in the first video, language is an amazing thing because it allows a concept that exists in one mind to be transferred to another mind, provided that two conditions are met. And one of those conditions is that both minds have to be running the same language software. And the other condition is that the mind that is on the receiving end of the conceptual transfer has to already possess a compatible conceptual context into which the concept that is being transferred can be integrated. And so, even though we may speak the same language, which makes it possible for you to understand the words I'm speaking, unless your mind already possesses a conceptual context that is compatible with the concepts that I am attempting to transfer to your mind using those words, you will not understand those concepts. That's just how our minds work, and there's no getting around it. And so I highly recommend that you watch the first video before you watch this video, or at the very least, its first 20 minutes, because otherwise it's likely that your mind will not be in possession of a conceptual context that will allow you to understand the concepts that I'm going to present in this video. And for those of you that decide to ignore that advice and continue watching this video without having seen the first video, when the point comes, and it will, if it hasn't already, where you say to yourself, I have no idea what this guy is talking about. Contrary to what your mind will tell you, it's probably not because I'm not adequately explaining the concepts I'm presenting, but it's probably because your mind does not possess a conceptual context that is compatible with those concepts, leaving those concepts with nowhere to go and so no way to be understood by your awareness. In any case, with all that out of the way, I will now, at long last, finally begin telling the story of what we really are and how we got here. Now, the hardest part of telling any story, at least in my opinion, is where to begin. And in this case, determining where to begin is especially difficult, inasmuch as the formless and fundamental reality that we really are has no beginning, because it's uncreated, and so always was, and always will be. One of the deepest and most profound of philosophical questions is the question, why is there anything? And believe it or not, that question has an answer, and that answer is where we will begin. The reason there is anything, and so the underlying reason for everything, is that at the very least, there has to be absolutely nothing. Get rid of absolutely everything, and what do you have left? Absolutely nothing. And if you were to somehow get rid of that absolute nothingness, you would still be left with absolutely nothing. And so you can't get past absolutely nothing. And so absolutely nothing is what is. And that absolute and uncreated nothingness is the reality that's both actually there and what you really are, beyond the physical and mental surface appearances. Now, to an individualized awareness that mistakenly believes itself to be some set of experiential somethings, being told that you are really absolutely nothing probably seems like a bad thing because it seems to represent some sort of diminishment of what you mistakenly believe yourself to be. But that's not actually the case. And that's because the absolute nothingness that you really are is actually everything, while at the same time it's not actually anything. And if that statement doesn't make any sense to you at this point, all I can say is that it will make perfect sense once you understand the nature of reality and so understand what you really are and how you got here. And so the story of what we really are and how we got here begins with an uncreated and formless absolute nothingness that can't not be. Now, here I need to point out that the formless and fundamental reality that is both actually there and what you really are lies beyond all understanding. That is, the non physical, non mental, non experiential reality of absolute nothingness that's actually there, causing all of this to happen, cannot itself be understood or described because it's formless. And so our minds can't do anything with it because the medium the mind works in is the medium of experiential form. But what can be described, and so what it is possible to understand, is how that formless, fundamental, and incomprehensible reality causes all of this to happen. Because how it happens is a process, and our minds can understand and describe processes. And the underlying process by which the formless and fundamental reality causes all this to happen is quite simple, even though that simple process ends up producing an incredible amount of experiential or surface appearance complexity that ends up obscuring the underlying simplicity of that process. And that simple process is a process of iterative and progressive self relation. Now, that may sound like a complicated process, but it's not. And I will now demonstrate that it's not by showing a video of a rubber band that's being repeatedly twisted upon itself and, as a result, undergoing a process of iterative and progressive self relation. Now, obviously, a rubber band is not a formless reality, but it can be used to demonstrate the process of iterative self relation by which the formless and fundamental reality becomes progressively and relationally structured as a function of its motion relative to itself. And as you can see, each level of relational structure, once it has come into existence, is able to function as the basis for the emergence of the next level of relational structure, as that already existent level of relational structure forms a relation with itself to then produce a higher order or more highly iterated level of relational structure, all of which are composed of the same reality. Now, the iterative part of the process that was just demonstrated has to do with the fact that the product of any one round of iteration of self relation is then fed back into the same process of self relation to produce a different and yet related product that is composed of a new way the same reality has become structured as a result of the new way that reality is able to be in relation to itself as a function of any and all prior iterations of self relation. And as shown in the rubber band video, the process of iterative self relation produces what I refer to as relational structures, because what that process produces are structures that are composed of the particular way that the reality that's undergoing that process has become structured as a function of the relations that it has formed with itself. Now, here you may say, that's all well and good for a rubber band, but how does a formless reality evolve into a relational structure? And the answer is in the same way that formless air or formless water becomes relationally structured into a tornado or a whirlpool, which is as a function of movement in relation to itself. And as I mentioned in the first video, someone a long time ago must have figured out that the universe is composed of an ultimately formless and unstructured reality that has become relationally structured as a function of its movement in relation to itself because they came up with this symbol. And so the reason the universe appears fractal is because what's actually there, where physical reality only appears to be, is a formless reality that has become relationally and progressively structured as a function of what is an iterative process. Put another way, the geometric structures that we call fractals are produced as the result of iterative processes, which again are processes where the product of one round of the process is then fed back into the same process to produce a related and yet different product. And because the formless reality that's actually there beyond the physical surface appearance has structurally evolved as the result of an iterative process, the structural product of that process is fractal in nature and so exhibits a fractal appearance when translated by our minds into the etching or appearance that we are aware of as physical reality. And fractals have a property that is referred to as self-similarity, which means that patterns tend to be repeated at different levels of iteration within a given fractal structure. And that's why a rubber band can be used to demonstrate the process by which the formless and fundamental reality evolves into the progressive series of relational structures that are actually there where physical reality appears to be. And that's also why formless air and water can temporarily evolve into the relational structures that we refer to as tornadoes and whirlpools as a function of self-relational movement. And that's because those physically perceivable processes are self-similar repetitions of the underlying process that the formless and fundamental reality that is actually there has undergone and is undergoing in order to function as the progressive series of relational awareness structures that are actually there where physical reality, as a mind generated projection like appearance, only appears to be. And so, already this early on in the telling of the story of what we really are and how we got here, we have already uncovered and revealed one of the seeming mysteries of the universe by explaining why the universe tends to generate structures that are fractal in nature. And just to be clear, the universe tends to generate structures that are fractal in nature because what's actually there, where the physical universe appears to be, is a singular reality that has undergone and continues to undergo a process of iterative self relation that is causing it to function as a progressive series of four related and yet different and distinct levels of relational structure, all of which are composed of that same singular and formless reality, no matter how differently they are structured and no matter how different they appear when translated to the level of physical experiential reality by our minds. Specifically, the four progressive levels of relational awareness structure that are actually there where the physical universe appears to be correspond to the four different physical realities that we perceive and refer to as space, light, matter, and animated or living matter. More specifically, the first level of relational awareness structure corresponds to what we perceive as empty physical space. The second level of relational awareness structure corresponds to what we perceive as light or electromagnetic radiation. The third level of relational awareness structure corresponds to what we perceive as inanimate matter. And the fourth level of relational awareness structure corresponds to what we perceive as animated or living matter. Because even though physical reality is not the reality that's actually there, what we are aware of as physical reality is not completely unrelated to certain structural aspects of the reality that is actually there, because what we are aware of as physical reality is a sort of mind generated etching of some of the relational awareness structures that are actually there. And so here I need to point out and make clear that the seeming emptiness of physical space is not because there's no relational awareness structure there, but is only because our minds are not able to form an impactive relation with the first level of relational structure, leaving our minds unable to use that level of relational structure to produce the experience of a physical object. And so what we perceive as empty physical space is analogous to the areas of an etching where no pigment is laid down on the rice paper, because there's no outwardly extending structure there for the etching pencil to form a relation with. Even though there is a structure there where the rice paper remains blank, that structure being the block of wood or stone or whatever out of which the image that's being etched has been carved. And in the same way, there is a first level of relational awareness structure there where empty physical space appears to be. And it is from and within that first level of relational awareness structure that the second, third, and fourth levels of relational awareness structure all extend and emerge as more highly iterated self relational forms of that structure. And because our minds, which are themselves fourth level relational structures, can form physical experience producing impactive relations with the second, third, and fourth levels of relational awareness structure, our minds are able to use those levels of relational structure to produce the etching like appearances that we become aware of as the universe of physical light and objects, both inanimate and animate, all of which appear to exist in empty physical space, analogous to the etched images that appear on an otherwise blank and empty sheet of rice paper. And so here I would like to point out that the physical universe does not appear as it appears as a result of our minds creating for us an objective representation of what's actually there. Instead, the physical universe appears as it appears, not primarily as a function of what's actually there, but primarily as a function of what relational structures our minds, through our physical senses, are able to form physical experience producing impactive relations with. Put another way, if our minds, through our physical senses, can form a physical experience producing impactive relation with a particular relational structure, then our minds can produce a physical experience by becoming involved in an impactive relation with that structure. And that physical experience, which is really just a mind generated appearance, is then projected by our minds onto the relational awareness structure that's actually there, helping to produce, in concert with our mind, the projected physical appearance. And we then mistake that created appearance for being the reality that's actually there, or for being in some way an objective representation of the reality that's actually there, which amounts to the same thing, even though that created physical appearance is a reality that is completely different in nature than the singular and fundamental reality that is actually there, both creating and aware of that appearance. And that mistake obscures from our individual awarenesses the reality that is actually there, and so obscures from our individual awarenesses the reality that we really are, and so leaves us with no choice but to misidentify with, and so know both the universe and ourselves as being a type of reality that is completely different in nature than the reality that both it and we really are. And the result of all that obscuring and misidentification is the effective entrapment of our individual awarenesses within mind-generated looking glass type realities that are composed of projected physical appearances and reflected mental appearances, and we suffer tremendously as a result. In any case, the process of iterative and progressive self-relation that was just described before I went off on that context-establishing tangent is the general process by which the formless and fundamental reality structurally evolves. And that general process was described in order to establish the context for what I'm going to do now, which is to begin to describe in as much detail as possible each level of relational awareness structure and how that level of relational structure corresponds to the particular physical etching that is produced when our minds form a physical experience producing impactive relation with that particular level of relational structure. Because in order to understand how any level of relational structure is structured and how it functions, you first need to understand how the preceding level of relational structure is structured and how it functions, because every level of relational structure, other than the first level, is composed of the way the preceding level of relational structure has formed a relation with itself to produce the next and so more highly iterated level of relational structure. And so the first level of relational awareness structure is a bit different than the three other levels of relational awareness structure that follow, inasmuch as the first level of relational awareness structure is the structural product of the first iteration of self-relation that the fundamental reality undergoes, and so is not the product of a relation that takes place between that which is itself the product of a relation. Instead, the first level of relational awareness structure is the product of a relation that takes place between and within what I refer to as the zero level of reality, which is the level of reality represented by the outer ring of the yin-yang diagram, which represents the formless and fundamental reality as it is before it has formed in relations with itself. Now, the reason the uncreated, formless, and fundamental reality at some point within itself begins moving in relation to itself at the speed of light is most likely a function of the arising of a spontaneous desire within the fundamental reality to become aware of itself. And I say that because at this level of reality, it is clearly the case that in order for my individual awareness to become directly aware of the fundamental reality, I need to direct my awareness toward that reality. And there is, at this point, no reason for me to assume that my individual awareness as that fundamental reality functions in a way that is any different than the way that same fundamental reality functions prior to or in the absence of flowing through and animating a structured form of itself. And so it may be the case that the fundamental reality is not intrinsically self-aware, but only has the capacity and innate ability to become self-aware, and for that capacity and innate ability to be actualized, it has to form a relation with itself, and in so doing, it becomes aware of itself and also becomes relationally structured. And the way the fundamental reality forms a relation with itself is by movement in relation to itself. And because the self-relational movement of that fundamental reality is the reality and movement out of which the entire universe is actually constructed and of which it is actually composed beyond the physical surface appearance, human beings unknowingly became aware of the speed at which that movement is taking place when we became aware of the speed of light as a constant speed and as the fastest speed that anything in this universe can go, even though we were not aware that that's what we had become aware of, except for maybe Einstein. Because it seems to me that the only way Einstein could have done what he did with his relativity theories is by understanding at some level that there was a reality there that was moving at the speed of light, and that what we perceive is not just energetic and material reality, but also space itself, are just different forms of that same reality and movement. And here's a quote from Einstein that expresses something of that sentiment, and which quote is taken from the introduction of a book he wrote called Relativity. I wish to show that space-time isn't necessarily something to which one can ascribe a separate existence, independently of the actual objects of physical reality. Physical objects are not in space, but these objects are spatially extended. In this way, the concept of empty space loses its meaning. And I apologize for the pathetic attempt at a German accent, but there's just no way I could read an Einstein quote and not at least give it a try. In any case, Einstein knew or believed there was some sort of structure there where empty physical space appears to be. He just didn't know what that structure was or how it functioned. And Einstein also knew or believed that understanding the structure of space was the key to understanding the characteristics of the electromagnetic and gravitational forces, at least according to the World of Physics, Volume 3, which I will now quote in my authoritative textbook accent. Einstein's efforts to uncover a unified field theory were rooted in his belief that the structure of space-time is the key to understanding the characteristics of the electromagnetic and gravitational forces. And as usual, Einstein was correct, because as you are going to see, understanding how the first level of relational awareness structure is structured and how it functions makes it possible to understand what both electromagnetic radiation and gravity really are at the level of relational structure, which then makes it possible to understand why those physical realities possess the particular physical characteristics they appear to possess. And what that means is that what I'm about to describe as the first level of relational awareness structure is the structure of space that Einstein spent much of his life trying to discover and understand. And I will, in this video, begin to present evidence that indicates that I am not completely full of shit in that regard by demonstrating that the physical characteristics of light have as their underlying basis what I am about to describe as the first and second levels of relational structure. However, the overwhelming evidence that effectively proves that the first level of relational structure is what's actually there where physical space appears to be will not come until I have described the third level of relational structure, which I will do in the next video, because it is at that level of relational structure that you will see Einstein's relativity of time and mass emerge naturally as a function of the way in which third level relational structures must structurally change in order to move faster or slower through the first level of relational structure. And so until then, you just have to bear with me, because I have to start out making statements whose only proof is what those statements lead to down the line in terms of understanding why the physical facts are as they are and how they are all related to each other through the first level of relational awareness structure that is actually there where empty physical space appears to be. In any case, the first level of relational structure is produced by the first relation that the formless and fundamental reality forms with itself as a result of its speed of light movement in relation to itself. And that first relation the fundamental reality forms with itself causes the fundamental reality to function as a first level of relational structure that has a very specific cellular geometry. And that space functions according to a very specific cellular geometry was first discovered by Buckminster Fuller, and then utilized by him to construct his architectural creations, after which his discovery that seemingly empty space has an underlying structure seems to have been pretty much ignored by science. And the specific cellular geometry that Fuller identified space as having is what is referred to as a cubic close packing arrangement of spheres, and that particular arrangement of spheres looks like this. And that particular arrangement of spheres produces a consistent set of geometric relations between those spheres that looks like this. And because the relationally structured universe is a fractal structure, and because fractals exhibit self-similarity, the emergence of a cellular structure where reality meets itself by moving in relation to itself can be easily demonstrated by turning on a faucet so that the water coming out of the faucet runs into the water that's already into the sink. And organic cellular structure is also a fractal repetition of that same pattern, which is the pattern of a cellular structure emerging at the point or interface where a reality meets itself as a function of movement in relation to itself. Specifically, in the case of the emergence of organic cellular structure, the sun is functioning as the faucet out of which a reality is flowing, while the Earth is functioning as a sort of pooling of that same reality. Because as I will eventually describe, matter, and so the Earth, is just light that has formed a stable relation with itself. And so the light emerging from the sun is just the unraveling of those relations, which then releases the more fundamental realities that were previously interacting to produce the matter of which the sun seems to be composed. And at the Earth's surface, where the light that's been released from the sun meets the light that's still taking part in a material relation, organic cellular structures eventually emerge, thereby repeating at a much higher level of iteration of self-relation the cellular pattern of structuring that first emerged as a result of the first iteration of self-relation that the fundamental reality underwent and continues to undergo. Now, I am pointing out these self-similar cellular patterns for two reasons, one of which is to make the extremely abstract more concrete, and the other of which is to make the point that it is not coincidence that fundamental patterns tend to repeat themselves. Instead, that fundamental patterns tend to repeat themselves is a function of what's actually happening to create the progressively and relationally structured reality that's actually there where the physical universe appears to be. And what's actually happening at that level is an iterative process, and specifically is a process of iterative and self-progressive self-relation. In any case, what I realized was that because the cellular structure of space that Fuller discovered is being produced by self-relational movement, it also had to have self-relational movement as an intrinsic part of its structure. And that's because the self-relational movement that produces the cellular structure does not stop once that structure exists, because that structure can only continue to exist as a structure as a function of the same movement that first brings it into existence as a structure. In the same way that you have to keep water running into a sink in order for the bubbles to keep appearing. In the same way that the sun needs to keep pouring out its light in order for cellular organic structures to survive. You see, we tend to think of structures as things that already exist that are then put into motion. And we see this tendency in the conception of the Big Bang, where it's conceived that some unknown thing existed and then exploded, creating space and putting everything in motion. But the underlying reality, meaning beyond the physical surface appearance, is that motion or movement is more fundamental than structure, because beyond the physical surface appearance, all structure only exists as a function of how the formless and fundamental reality has become structured as a result of its speed of light movement in relation to itself. For example, a whirlpool is a structure, but it's a structure that is composed of a particular way formless water is moving in relation to itself. And in the same way, reality beyond the physical surface appearance has a structure, but that structure only exists as a function of the speed of light movement of the formless and fundamental reality in relation to itself. And so there is an event that produces the progressively and relationally structured reality that's actually there where the physical universe appears to be, but that event is not a Big Bang or some extremely tiny and dense structure exploding and then being put into motion. Instead, the event that produces the progressively and relationally structured reality that's actually there where the physical universe appears to be is nothing more than the movement of the fundamental reality in relation to itself. What that means is that what's really fundamental in the universe is not structure, because what's really fundamental in the universe is the formless and fundamental reality and its speed of light movement in relation to itself, because it is that fundamental movement that causes the formless and fundamental reality to exist and function as a progressive series of relational structures that are composed solely and entirely of that fundamental reality moving in relation to itself, in the same way that a whirlpool is a relational structure composed of formless water moving in relation to itself. And because the universe is ultimately and actually composed of the fundamental reality moving at the speed of light, there is no point in the universe where there is actually anything there other than the fundamental reality moving at the speed of light. All kinds of physical stuff may appear to be there and may appear to be moving at speeds that are far less than the speed of light, but as you will see, once I get around to describing the third level of relational structure, which is the level that corresponds to what we perceive as matter, what's actually there where any bit of matter appears to be is just a more highly iterated and so more highly structured version of the same reality moving at the same speed, which is always the speed of light. And now, all that having been said, we will now integrate that self-relational speed of light movement into the cellular structure of reality that was discovered by Buckminster Fuller. And when the same speed of light movement of the fundamental reality in relation to itself that produces the cellular structure of reality is integrated into that cellular structure, what we end up with is a structure that appears like this when represented in two dimensions. And as I mentioned in the first video, the speed of the self-relational movement that is implicit in the yin-yang symbol is not arbitrary or unknown, but is taking place at the speed of light. And what I also realized is that the cellular structure of reality does not exist at a single scale, but must exist at an infinite or near infinite number of interrelated scales, all of which have the same cubic close packing geometry. And what that looks like in two dimensions is this. And that's because what each cell or sphere represents is a point within the fundamental reality where it meets itself while moving in relation to itself at the speed of light. And the point at which the fundamental reality meets itself does not itself have a single scale, because the fundamental reality itself is dimensionless and so has no scale. And so the point within itself where the fundamental reality meets itself while moving at the speed of light must be that which creates what we become aware of as scale. And so those points must exist at every scale simultaneously, while still having the same cellular structure at each level of scale. And so, the speed of light relation of the dimensionless fundamental reality to itself produces a multi-leveled cellular structure that is the underlying basis of what we become aware of as physical space that has three dimensions. Put another way, what has just been described is how a three-dimensional space composed of a dimensionless reality comes to exist within that dimensionless reality as a place where higher order relational structures composed of that same dimensionless reality can exist and move about. But as will be described, those higher order relational structures can only exist and move about within that three-dimensional space as a function of the structure and dynamic of the three-dimensional relational awareness structure that is actually there where empty physical space appears to be. And as you will see as we go along, that's why there are physical laws and constants. In any case, this drawing is my representation of the first level of relational structure, and it depicts both the multi-leveled cellular nature of that structure as well as the self-relational speed of light movement that both produces and is intrinsic to that cellular structure. And so you now have a conceptual representation of the first level relational awareness structure that is actually there where empty physical space appears to be. And this first level of relational awareness structure is the structure of space or unified field that Einstein knew had to be there and so was looking for. Because as you will see as we go along, the speed of light movement that is intrinsic to that structure is the singular force from which all else that is known as force derives as just a more highly iterated form of that same movement. And now that we have this conceptual representation, we will use this conceptual representation to describe the general anatomy of the first level of relational structure, keeping in mind that anatomy is not just about structure, but is also about function. And so what I'm going to do next is describe how the first level of relational structure functions as a dynamic structure, or as a structure that is composed of and so contains within itself the same self-relational movement that causes it to exist as a structure. And in order to do that, I first need to define the components of that structure in terms of both structure and the content that exists within that structure. In terms of structure, the first level of relational structure consists of a particular geometric arrangement of what I refer to as reality cells. And any one reality cell is both bigger than and smaller than other reality cells that exist at different scales, while all reality cells at the same scale are exactly the same size. However, all reality cells at all scales, and so reality cells of all sizes, contain the exact same content, and that exact same content consists of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality taking place in a particular direction. And so the self-relational movement that exists within every reality cell has both the same speed and the same direction. Now, I don't know what that direction is, or if it is even expressible as a physical reality, but it doesn't matter, because all we need to know is that that movement has a particular direction, and that that direction of movement, whatever it might be, is the same for all the reality cells at all scales that, taken together, make up the first level of relational awareness structure that's actually there where empty physical space appears to be. And because all the reality cells of which the first level of relational structure is composed all have the exact same content, I refer to the content that exists at the first level of relational structure as uniform reality cell content. And now that reality cell content has been defined, I can now define how the first level of relational structure functions as a dynamic structure. And the way the first level of relational structure functions as a dynamic structure is as a sort of mechanism that ends up with each reality cell continuously exchanging its content with all 12 reality cells of the same scale or size that are adjacent to it. And what that looks like, depicted in a static two-dimensional drawing, is this. And the speed at which that exchange of content is taking place is the same for all reality cells at all levels of scale. And the singular speed at which that exchange of content is taking place is, you guessed it, the speed of light, because that's the only speed there really is in the entire universe, at the level of what's actually there beyond the physical surface appearance. And so all of seemingly empty space is in motion at the speed of light, but we don't perceive anything is happening or any movement is taking place within apparently empty space because what's being exchanged at that level, and so what's moving at that level, is uniform reality cell content, which is to say reality cell content that's all moving in the same direction. And so it seems like nothing is happening, even though what's actually happening where empty physical space appears to be is the engine and force behind all perceived physical movement. And here is a quote from the physicist David Bohm in which he expressed a similar sentiment regarding the nature of what we perceive as empty space. What we call empty space contains an immense background of energy. This vast sea of energy may play a key part in the understanding of the cosmos as a whole. Space, which has so much energy, is full rather than empty. What we perceive through the senses as empty space is actually the plenum, which is the ground for the existence of everything, including ourselves. Now here's the interesting thing, and this interesting thing will be very important once I have described the anatomy of second level relational structures, and then begin to relate that anatomy to the physical reality that we know as light or electromagnetic radiation. And the interesting thing is this. Although the speed at which the exchange of reality cell content takes place between adjacent reality cells is the same for all reality cells of all sizes, the rate or frequency at which that content is fully exchanged from one reality cell to another is different for reality cells that have different sizes. Specifically, the rate or frequency of full content exchange of relatively smaller reality cells is relatively faster than the rate or frequency of full content exchange of relatively larger reality cells. And so conversely, the rate or frequency of full content exchange of relatively larger reality cells is relatively slower than the rate or frequency of full content exchange of relatively smaller reality cells. And the reason that is the case is simply because the same identical content moving at the same speed does not have as far to go in order to fully exchange content when that content is being exchanged between reality cells that are relatively smaller. And conversely, the same identical content moving at the same speed simply has farther to go in order to fully exchange content when that content is being exchanged between reality cells that are relatively larger. And so there is an inverse relation between reality cell size and the frequency of full content exchange that takes place between those reality cells. An inverse relation simply meaning that when one goes up to a certain degree, the other goes down to a related degree, and vice versa. And in an inverse relation, the degree to which one factor goes up as the other goes down, or vice versa, is usually a function of a third factor that is constant. And with regard to the inverse relation between reality cell size and frequency of full content exchange, the third factor that is constant is the speed of light exchange of reality cell content that is continuously taking place between all adjacent reality cells. And what I'm going to show once I have described the anatomy of second level relational structures is that the inverse relation between reality cell size and frequency of full content exchange is the underlying and so non-physical basis of what we physically perceive as the inverse relation between the wavelength and frequency of electromagnetic radiation, and which inverse relation has as its third and constant factor the speed of light. And so what I'm going to show is that what we perceive as the speed of light constant has as its underlying and so actual basis the constant speed at which reality cell content is being continuously exchanged between all adjacent reality cells as a function of the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure. And because the speed at which reality cell content is being continuously exchanged between all adjacent reality cells is itself a function of the speed at which the fundamental reality is moving as it becomes involved in the relation with itself that causes it to function as the first level of relational structure, making the connection between the speed of light and the speed of reality cell content exchange will demonstrate that the reason no physical thing can go faster than the speed of light is simply because no such speed exists at the level of what is actually there. Because at the level of what is actually there, meaning beyond the physical appearances, there is only one reality moving at one speed. And I'm pointing this out now because one of the main things that I want people to be able to see is that no matter what we are talking about in terms of relational structure, that what we are always really talking about is some structured form of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, because that's all that's ever actually there, because that's all there actually is beyond the mind-generated physical appearances that we mistakenly believe to be realities that are actually and objectively there. This is the Wizard of Oz, people, and we are going down the yellow brick road. And when we get to the end of that road, we will have pulled aside the veil to show that behind the great and powerful physical reality that we mistakenly believe to be the reality that's actually there, there is just a single reality undergoing a single process. And that the reality that you really are is that reality. And that that single and formless reality is not other than the formless awareness that is aware of what I'm saying right now. Name one reality of which you're not aware. It cannot be done. And the reason it can't be done is because there's no such thing as a reality absent the awareness of that reality. And the reason there's no such thing as a reality absent the awareness of that reality is because formless awareness is the fundamental reality. And so all that can be known as real either is that fundamental reality or is an appearance that is being created both by and within that fundamental reality and then known by that fundamental reality as a reality. Now you can believe all day, every day, that realities can exist absent the reality of awareness, the same way you can believe all day, every day that unicorns actually exist. But the demonstrable and indisputable fact is that no reality has ever existed in the absence of the reality that we refer to as awareness. And if you would like to prove me wrong on that point, all you have to do is name one reality of which you are not aware. You see, in the topsy-turvy looking glass world that almost all human awarenesses are presently trapped within, it is mistakenly believed that the experiential appearances are more fundamental and so more real than the reality that is actually fundamental and so is actually more real than the experiential appearances, and which truly fundamental reality is both creating and aware of those experiential appearances. And that mistaken belief then leads naturally to the mistaken belief that those experiential appearances have some existence outside and beyond the context of the reality of awareness, despite the indisputable fact that no such reality has ever been identified or ever will be identified, for the simple reason that there is no such thing as a reality absent some awareness being aware of that thing as a reality. But we ignore that somewhat obvious and indisputable fact because it doesn't fit our present conception of reality, and in which present conception physical reality is seen as primary, while the reality of awareness or consciousness is seen as a secondary reality that is somehow being created by physical reality, despite the fact that absent the reality of awareness, there simply is no such thing as a reality of any sort. And again, if you would like to prove me wrong on that point, all you have to do is name one reality of which you are not aware. The bottom line is this: the formless awareness that is aware of reality is more fundamental and so more real than the realities of which it is aware, regardless of what that awareness may believe with regard to the hierarchy of reality. And the only time that is not true is when an awareness is directly aware of its own reality, in which case there is then an identity and equivalence between the awareness that is aware of reality and the reality that awareness is aware of. And at the present time, it is simply the case that only a relative handful of human awarenesses ever exercise their innate ability to become directly aware of the formless reality they really are, because right now, most human awarenesses don't even know that such a thing is possible. Because right now, most human awarenesses are effectively trapped within, and so continuously operating from within, a mind generated conception of reality that continuously obscures and denies their own reality. In any case, it is the formless and fundamental reality that we refer to as awareness that has structurally evolved into the series of four progressive relational structures that are actually there where we perceive the physical realities of space, light, matter, and animated matter to be. And that formless and fundamental reality, as it flows through and animates the relationally structured forms of itself that are actually there where our physical bodies appear to be, has become mistakenly aware of what are only mind generated experiential appearances as being realities that are actually there, where only it actually is. And as a result of that misconception, it has obscured its own reality from its awareness, leaving those individualized flows of awareness effectively trapped in mind generated experiential environments and identities where they have no choice but to become and remain aware of a persistent undercurrent of both fear and a sense of incompleteness. And we are in the middle of telling the story of how the formless and fundamental reality that you really are manages to put itself in that bizarre, unwanted, and uncomfortable situation so that your individualized awareness can begin to free itself from that situation so that you can live your organic life from a different perspective that is not defined and bounded by an experiential cage that you are yourself unknowingly creating and maintaining. And so let's continue with the part of that story that describes how the formless reality that you really are, by moving in relation to itself at the speed of light, structurally evolves into the relational structures that are actually there, where physical space, physical energy, and physical objects, both inanimate and animate, only appear to be. And we have now come to the part of that story where I will describe the second level of relational structure, which again is the level of relational structure that corresponds to what we perceive as light or electromagnetic radiation. Because you now know everything you need to know about the structure and functioning of the first level of relational structure in order to be able to understand what I'm about to describe as the structure and functioning of second level relational structures. Now, second level relational awareness structures, because they are a second level of relational structure, emerge within the first level of relational awareness structure as a function of a relation that the first level of relational structure is able to form with itself once it has come into existence. And so, in order to describe second level relational structures, the first question we have to ask and answer is, what sort of relation can the first level of relational structure form with itself? And the answer to that question is the relation that the first level of relational structure can form with itself is a relation that involves reality cell content and specifically involves the reality cell content of a single reality cell having its direction of self-relational movement completely reversed. So there's no longer just unidirectional or uniform content within the first level of relational structure. And that relation of reality cell content to reality cell content looks like this. And so depicted in this drawing are 7 reality cells, with the outer 6 reality cells all having a counterclockwise direction of self-relational movement, and so all having what has been defined as uniform reality cell content. However, the central reality cell now has a direction of self-relational movement that is the exact opposite of the uniform direction of self-relational movement, and so is depicted as having a clockwise direction. And that clockwise or opposite direction of self-relational movement will be defined as distorted reality cell content, simply because it represents a distortion of what is an otherwise uniform pattern of reality cell content. And so the emergence of distorted reality cell content within a single reality cell is the relation that the first level of relational structure can form with itself once the fundamental reality is functioning as a first level of relational structure. Now, I have no idea how such a complete reversal of the direction of self-relational movement is able to take place, But what I do know is that such complete reversals of direction must take place, because everything that we know at the physical level as some form of energy is ultimately some degree of distortion of reality cell content, as that distorted content is acted upon by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure, and so is propagated through the first level of relational structure as a function of the speed of light exchange of reality cell content that continuously takes place between all adjacent reality cells of the same size. And so what I'm going to do now is describe how a distortion of reality cell content that exists in a single reality cell is acted upon by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure. And the way that such a distortion of reality cell content is acted upon by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure is that it is propagated through the first level of relational structure at the speed of light as a radially propagating and exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion of reality cell content. Now, that's a lot of words to describe what is ultimately a relatively simple process. And since a single picture can speak 1,000 words, I'm now going to use drawings to illustrate that relatively simple process so that you can hopefully grasp the simplicity of what must otherwise seem to be a complicated process when that process is stated and defined using only words. And so we begin with the first level of relational structure as it first comes to exist, which is with all reality cell content existing as uniform content, and with that uniform content being exchanged at the speed of light. And here I need to point out that in all of the drawings that will be used to illustrate the propagation of distorted reality cell content through the first level of relational structure, uniform or non-distorted reality cell content will be depicted as circles that are colored white inside, whereas distorted or non-uniform reality cell content will be depicted as circles that are colored either black inside or in some shade of gray, depending on whether that distorted content is maximally distorted or is less than maximally distorted. And the difference between a maximal and less than maximal distortion of reality cell content will become clear as we go along. In any case, this drawing shows 19 reality cells that all have uniform reality cell content. And then the process of self-relation that produced the first level of relational awareness structure then operates on the first level of relational structure, causing the first level of relational structure to form a relation with itself. And that event is depicted like this. And so what this drawing shows is that the central reality cell has somehow undergone a complete reversal of its intrinsic direction of self-relational movement, and so now exists as what will be defined as a maximal distortion of reality cell content. But that maximal distortion of reality cell content does not exist as a maximal distortion for very long once it comes into existence, because the moment it comes into existence, it is operated upon by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure. And what that means is that that maximally distorted reality cell exchanges its distorted content with all 12 adjacent reality cells, only 6 of which are depicted in this two-dimensional drawing, while all 12 adjacent reality cells simultaneously exchange their uniform content with that maximally distorted reality cell. And the result of all that exchanging of reality cell content after one full cycle or period of content exchange looks like this. Now what this drawing shows is that the central reality cell, which was maximally distorted, now has a uniform pattern of content, while all the reality cells that are adjacent to that central reality cell no longer have uniform content, but instead contain reality cell content that will be defined as a less than maximal distortion of reality cell content. And that's because those adjacent reality cells are not just exchanging content with the central reality cell, but are also exchanging content with the 11 other reality cells that are also adjacent to them, all of which had uniform reality cell content. And so the degree of content distortion that those 12 adjacent reality cells end up with after one full exchange of reality cell content is only 1/12 of the maximal distortion that was present in the central reality cell prior to that exchange of content. And that's why the reality cell content that those adjacent reality cells end up with is referred to as a less than maximal distortion of reality cell content. Because although those reality cells still contain content that is not of the uniform variety, the content they do contain is no longer maximally distorted, because that maximal distortion of content was essentially diluted as it entered those adjacent reality cells. And now let's look at what happens to that radially propagating distortion of reality cell content following one more round of full content exchange. Now here I'm only going to focus on what happens at the periphery as the distortion of reality cell content radially propagates away from its point of origin at the speed of light. Because if I try to explain what goes on in the center, it just becomes too confusing, and that's not important right now. Because right now I'm just trying to explain the basics of how a distortion of reality cell content is propagated through the first level of relational structure so that we can get to the point where I can put forth a meaningful description of what exactly constitutes a second level relational structure. In any case, what happens to that radially propagating distortion of reality cell content following one more round of full content exchange is that it becomes even more diluted and becomes exponentially diluted, because once again that distorted content is entering an adjacent reality cell that is also exchanging content with 11 other adjacent reality cells, most of which have uniform content. And as that now less than maximal distortion of reality cell content continues to radially propagate away from its point of origin at the speed of light, it continues to become exponentially diluted, so that with each round of full content exchange into a more distal or outward reality cell, that less than maximal distortion of reality cell content becomes exponentially less distorted. And this drawing is a sort of time-lapse image of the outward ancel radial propagation of an exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion of reality cell content, where each reality cell is depicted as it was when it had its greatest level of reality cell content distortion, in order to illustrate as best I can in a static two-dimensional drawing how a complete reversal of the direction of self-relational movement taking place in a single reality cell is operated upon by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure. Now, what was just described does not constitute a second level of relational structure, because relational structures are relatively stable structures. What was just described just explains one of the things that can happen to a distortion of reality cell content when it is operated upon by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure, and so is transferred to an adjacent reality cell. And as just explained, one of the things that can happen to that distorted content is that it can become less distorted. But that's not the only thing that can happen to a distortion of reality cell content when it is transferred to an adjacent reality cell as a function of the speed of light exchange of reality cell content that is continuously taking place at the first level of relational structure. That's just the thing that can happen when the other adjacent reality cells that are exchanging content with the reality cell that is receiving that distorted content have either uniform or much less distorted content, so that the distorted content becomes diluted or relatively less once it exists in the reality cell that is receiving that distorted content. The other thing that can happen to a distortion of reality cell content when it is transferred to an adjacent reality cell is that that distorted content can combine or summate with the distortion content that is coming from other reality cells that are adjacent to the reality cell that is receiving that distorted content, so that the reality cell that is receiving the distorted content ends up with a degree of content distortion that is greater than what it was in those adjacent reality cells. And so, to summarize, once the first level of relational structure exists, that structure can form a relation with itself. And that relation is a relation that involves the self-relational movement that is taking place in a single reality cell undergoing a complete reversal of its direction of self-relational movement, so that that reality cell then contains what has been defined as a maximal distortion of reality cell content. And once such distorted content exists, that distorted content is then operated on by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure, and so is transferred to adjacent reality cells, where it then exists in either a diluted form or a more concentrated form, which is to say, either less distorted or more distorted, because whatever reality cell that distorted content enters into is also exchanging content with 11 other adjacent reality cells. But here's the thing about reality cell content becoming either less distorted or more distorted as it enters a new reality cell. Although there is no limit to the degree to which distorted reality cell content can become diluted and so less distorted, owing to the infinitely recursive structure of the first level of relational structure, there is a limit to the degree to which distorted reality cell content can become concentrated or more distorted. And that's because reality cell content cannot become more distorted than maximally distorted. And that's because what distorted reality cell content really is a particular direction of self-relational movement that exists within a reality cell, or some combination of particular directions of self-relational movement that exists within a reality cell. And a reality cell just cannot have an intrinsic direction of self-relational movement that is more opposite than the intrinsic direction of self-relational movement that has been defined as uniform reality cell content. And so a reality cell cannot be more distorted than maximally distorted. So no matter how much distortion content enters a central reality cell from adjacent reality cells, the most distorted that central reality cell can become is maximally distorted. On the other hand, no matter how little distortion content enters a central reality cell from adjacent reality cells, that central reality cell then contains non-uniform content, or content that has been defined as a less than maximal distortion of reality cell content. Now, as painful as all of that was to describe and listen to, it had to be done in order to provide the context for what I will now describe as second level relational awareness structures. And that's because second level relational structures are dynamic structures that have two related components, one of which is a linearly propagating maximal distortion component, and the other of which is a radially propagating exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion component. You see, what we are doing here is putting together a puzzle. And when all is said and done, we will end up with a relatively complete picture of the relationally structured reality that is actually there, where physical reality only appears to be. And then we will use that picture to explain what the mind is and how the reality that we really are uses our individual minds to interact with that relationally structured reality to produce the mind-generated appearances that we are aware of as physical and mental reality, and which appearances we then mistake for being realities that are both actually there and what we really are, thereby obscuring from our individual awarenesses the reality that is actually there, and thereby obscuring from our individual awarenesses the reality that we really are. And so right now we are putting together a puzzle that is itself just a part of a larger puzzle that we are in the process of assembling, and which larger puzzle will give you a clear picture of the situation that the reality that you really are has placed itself in as a result of being born into this world as a human being, so that you can then hopefully begin to free yourself from that situation, because it's not an enjoyable situation to be in. And when you put together a puzzle, there is one part of the process that is somewhat tedious and not very much fun. Now, I realize that there are those out there who feel that every part of the process of assembling a puzzle is tedious and not very much fun, and I get that, because not everyone is a puzzle person. But there is one part of the process that even many puzzle people do not enjoy, and that is the part of the process where you have to turn all the pieces over so you can see the partial image that piece contains. So you can get to the fun part where you put those pieces or partial images together to produce a larger and more complete image. And right now we are in the part of our puzzle assembly process that is analogous to having to take out the pieces and turn them all over so we can see what's there. But we are very close to being done with that part of the process and are about to get to the fun part where we will start to put the pieces together. But in order to get to that part, we have to turn over one more piece of the puzzle by describing and defining the nature of second level relational structures. And so let's just get it over with so we can get to the fun part where we will begin to relate relationally structured reality to the fundamental features and characteristics of physical reality, so that we can see where those fundamental features and characteristics of physical reality actually come from and how they are all related. And so, as I said just before I went off on my puzzle making tangent and analogy, second level relational structures are dynamic structures that have two related components, one of which is a linearly propagating maximal distortion component, and the other of which is a radially propagating exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion component. Now, the reason second level relational structures have these two components is because second level relational structures are self-reproducing distortion processes that self-reproduce as a result of each of its two distortion components continually recreating the other component. And once again, we have to use a lot of words to describe what is ultimately a relatively simple process. And so let's use some drawings so we can see that underlying simplicity. This is a time-lapse image of a second-level relational structure propagating through the first level of relational structure, driven as always by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure. Specifically, on the left is a time-lapse side view image of a second-level relational structure, and on the right is a time-lapse cross-section of that same structure. And now let's look at a close-up image of the side view so that we can define the anatomy of second-level relational structures and explain how each distortion component continually recreates the other distortion component, thereby producing a very stable self-reproducing distortion process that exists as a second level of a relational awareness structure that emerges and operates within the first level of relational awareness structure. In this drawing, the linearly propagating maximal distortion component is depicted as the series of black circles progressing from left to right, while the radially propagating exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion component is depicted as circles that have incrementally lighter shades of gray the farther they get from their point of origin. Now, in reality, as a second level relational structure propagates through the first level of relational structure, the linearly propagating maximal distortion component only exists in one reality cell at any one moment. But I'm using a sort of time-lapse image of that propagation in order to make it easier to visualize the two different distortion components that continuously interact to produce any second level relational structure, and the speed at which the maximal distortion component linearly propagates through the first level of relational structure, one reality cell at a time, regardless of reality cell size, is at the speed of light, because that's the speed at which reality cell content is being continuously exchanged at the first level of relational structure, regardless of reality cell size and regardless of whether that content is of the uniform or distorted variety. And the exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion component is also propagating at the speed of light for the same reason, but it is propagating away from its point of origin at that speed, and so is propagating outwardly or radially. And the point of origin of the exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion component is the maximally distorted reality cell that always exists at the leading edge of any second level relational structure, as that maximally distorted reality cell exchanges content with the 12 reality cells that are adjacent to it. And so the way the linearly propagating maximal distortion component continually reproduces the radially propagating less than maximal distortion component is fairly straightforward, and was to some degree already explained when I first explained how a maximal distortion of reality cell content arising in a single reality cell would propagate outwardly or radially away from that point at the speed of light as an exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion of reality cell content. But what has not yet been explained is how the radially propagating less than maximal distortion that is being outwardly radiated by the maximal distortion functions to help reproduce that maximal distortion in the next reality cell in linear progression. And that is also fairly straightforward, because as these close-up drawings depict, what happens is that the less than maximal distortion that was outwardly radiated in a previous cycle or period of content exchange, then in the next cycle or period of content exchange, inwardly exchanges content with the next reality cell in linear progression that is also exchanging content with the maximally distorted reality cell. And so all that distorted reality cell content converges on the next reality cell in linear progression and summates in that reality cell to reproduce a maximal distortion of reality cell content in the next reality cell in linear progression. And then that maximal distortion radiates around itself a less than maximal distortion that helps to reproduce the maximal distortion in the next reality cell in linear progression, and on it goes, like a very fast-moving and somewhat modified game of leapfrog. And all of that exchanging of distorted reality cell content, which is driven by the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure, results in the propagation of a second level relational structure through the first level of relational structure at the speed of light. And second level relational structures qualify as a new level of relational awareness structure because they are composed of a new and stable way the self relational movement of the fundamental reality is able to become structured as a function of the first stable way that the self relational movement of the fundamental reality became structured. Because keep in mind that even though I am using drawings that show reality cells that contain content that is white, black, or some shade of gray, what those different colors depict are just opposite directions or different combinations of those opposite directions of what is ultimately the same self relational movement of the same fundamental reality as it exists within a particular reality cell. And so, what second level relational structures really are is the patterned or structured movement of what is itself a fundamental self relational movement. And I keep pointing that out because I have to use different words to define the different aspects of that fundamental self relational movement as it exists at different levels of relational structure. And so it's easy to lose sight of the fact that no matter what words we are using, what is still being described is what happens when a single reality moves in relation to itself at the speed of light, because that's all that's really there and that's all that's happening. It's just that it keeps happening over and over again, at least 4 times from what I can tell, thereby making it possible for the same formless reality moving at the same speed to exist as a progressive series of 4 different and yet completely inseparable relational structures. And what has just been described as the first 2 levels of relational structure the formless and fundamental reality evolves into or is able to function as a function of its speed of light movement in relation to itself. And those first 2 levels of relational structure correspond to the physical realities that we refer to as space and light. And now that has been done, we have finally finished turning over the pieces of the puzzle and can now start putting it together by showing how the features and characteristics of the first 2 levels of relational structure exist as the underlying basis of the features and characteristics of the physical reality that we refer to as light or electromagnetic radiation. Because unless I can relate this conceptual model of reality to known physical facts, it is completely meaningless. Because there is no other way to judge whether or not this conceptual model accurately depicts what is happening beyond the physical surface appearance other than to relate what has been described as existing and happening beyond the physical surface appearance to the mind-generated physical etchings that we create by forming physical experience producing impactive relations with the relational awareness structures that I claim are actually there where physical reality appears to be. As I said in the first video and throughout the book, we can connect mental dots however we want to form any concept we want, and so can create concepts and interpretations of reality that may or may not correlate with any situation, circumstance, or reality that actually exists anywhere other than in our minds. But physical reality and physical facts cannot tell a lie because the only way to produce a physical reality is by forming an impactive relation with a relational structure that is actually there, where the mind generated and mind projected physical reality then appears to be. And so, even though physical reality is just a projected appearance and so is not what's actually there or objectively representative of what's actually there, physical reality is not completely unrelated to the relational structures that are actually there because physical reality is tethered to those relational structures as a function of its method of creation. And that's why the only way to have any assurance that one's conceptual model of reality accurately represents whatever underlying and unperceivable reality one is trying to represent, and is not just an idea that one has pulled out of their ass, is to relate the components of that conceptual model to known physical facts. Because physical facts are the only way we can know and verify anything at all with respect to the relational structures that are actually there. Because the only way to create a physical reality is by forming an impactive relation with a relational structure, which then produces a physical appearance that provides us with relative and non objective information regarding that relational structure. And so, in just a few minutes, I'm going to begin relating the components of this conceptual model to known physical facts. But before I do that, I need to mention one thing, and that is, although I understand how second level relational structures function once they exist, I do not know exactly how they come to exist. I know that the first level of relational structure can form a relation with itself, and that relation produces what I have defined as a maximal distortion of reality cell content. And I also know that such a distortion of content must be propagated through the first level of relational structure at the speed of light as a radially propagating and exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion of reality cell content. But what I do not know is exactly how second level relational structures come into existence as self reproducing distortion processes. However, what I do know is that something must happen that causes these types of relational structures to emerge within the first level of relational structure. Because as you will see as we go along, understanding that second level relational structures exist and understanding how they must propagate and interact as a function of the structure and dynamic that exist at the first level of relational structure will make it possible to understand why the physical characteristics of light and matter exist as they do, and also how those characteristics are all related. Now, it is most likely the case that second level relational structures come into existence as a function of two or three maximal distortions spontaneously and simultaneously arising in close proximity to each other, so that when those two or three maximal distortions are then acted upon by the dynamic that's intrinsic to the first level of relational structure, they interact in a way that effectively gives birth to a self reproducing and so stable distortion process that does not just dissipate and fade away as a radially propagating, exponentially diminishing, less than maximal distortion. And it most likely happens that way because there's just not all that much happening at the level of relational structure, which is to say, at the level of what's actually there beyond the physical appearance. Because at that level, there's just a single reality doing one thing over and over again. And that one thing is forming relations with itself while moving at the speed of light. And so once the first level of relational structure exists, it forms a relation with itself, and that relation exists as a maximal distortion of reality cell content. And if two or more maximal distortions simultaneously arise in proximity, then it must be possible for those distortions, when acted upon by the dynamic that's intrinsic to the first level of relational structure, to form a relation that results in the production and existence of the self reproducing binary distortion process that has been defined and described as a second level relational awareness structure. Now, some of you may think I explain things too much or that I go into too much detail, but I am just explaining things to you in the way that I would want them explained to me if I was the one listening to me. And the way I like things explained to me is in an unbroken chain of cause and effect logic and reason that is both internally consistent and also supported by physical facts. And so, what I do not like are logical leaps that do not show a direct cause and effect relation. But in order to arrive at a second level of relational structure, I had to make a logical leap to get from a maximal distortion to a second level relational structure without being able to establish a specific chain of cause and effect from one to the other. But that does not mean that such a chain of cause and effect does not exist. It just means I haven't been able to figure out exactly what it is. Partly because I haven't really put much effort into trying to do so, because once I arrived at the concept of second level relational structures, the evidence they provided regarding the accuracy of the model was so overwhelming that I no longer cared that such a small gap existed in the model. And so, without further ado, let's begin to get into that evidence. Now, as I've said repeatedly, second level relational awareness structures are what's actually there where we perceive the physical reality of light or electromagnetic radiation to be, because physical reality is a sort of mind generated etching of certain structural aspects of the reality that's actually there. And since that's the case, the physical characteristics of light should correlate in some way with what has just been described as the anatomy and functioning of second level relational structures. As I will now demonstrate, not only is there some correlation, there is complete correlation because every physical characteristic of light directly corresponds to a particular aspect of what has just been described as the second level relational awareness structures that emerge and exist within the first level of relational awareness structure. And when I said that second level relational awareness structures are what's actually there, where we perceive the physical reality of light or electromagnetic radiation to be, that was only partly true. because more specifically, what's actually there where we perceive the physical reality of light or electromagnetic radiation to be is just the linearly propagating maximal distortion component of a second level relational structure. And so it is that component of second level relational structures that we will relate to the physical characteristics of light. I will eventually correlate the radially propagating less than maximal distortion component of second level relational structures to physical reality, but that can't be done until the third level of relational structure has been described, because it is only when that radially propagating component functions at that level of relational structure that it is able to produce its own sort of physical experience, and specifically produces what we perceive and conceive as the force of gravity. And so that evidence will be presented in the next video, where I will describe how second level relational structures form stable relations with each other to produce the third level relational awareness structures that are actually there where we perceive matter to be. In any case, what we're going to do now is relate the physical characteristics of light to the maximal distortion component of second level relational structures. And the way we are going to do that is by relating the components of the two equations that state the relations that exist between the physical characteristics of light to what has just been described as a linearly propagating maximal distortion of reality cell content. And the two equations that state the relations that exist between the physical characteristics of light are frequency multiplied by wavelength equals the speed of light, and energy equals Planck's constant multiplied by frequency. And so between them, these two equations contain 5 related physical characteristics associated with the apparent physical realities that we refer to as light: wavelength, frequency, speed of light constant, Planck's constant, and energy. And what will now be demonstrated is that 4 of those 5 physical characteristics are physical etchings that correspond directly to 4 non-physical characteristics that are possessed by the linearly propagating maximal distortion component of any second level relational structure, thereby providing evidence that those conceptual structures are accurately reflective of the relationally structured reality that's actually there where the physical reality of light only appears to be. Let's begin with the physical characteristic of light known as wavelength. What the physical characteristic of light known as wavelength is derived from at the level of relational structure is the specific size of the reality cells through which the maximal distortion component of a second level relational structure is propagating. Specifically, a maximal distortion component that is propagating through relatively larger reality cells is observed or etched physically as light that has a relatively longer wavelength, whereas a maximal distortion component that is propagating through relatively smaller reality cells is observed or etched physically as light that has a relatively shorter wavelength. And so, as hard as it may be to comprehend or grasp, there is no physical wavelength actually there where the wavelength of light is observed to be. And that's because what's actually there where the physical characteristic of wavelength only appears to be is a first level of relational structure that is composed of reality cells that come in different and yet discrete sizes, some relatively larger than others and some relatively smaller than others. And it is through those differently and discretely sized reality cells that maximal distortions of reality cell content are linearly propagated at the same constant speed at which reality cell content is continuously being exchanged between adjacent reality cells. And that constant speed is the speed of light, because that's the speed at which the fundamental reality is moving as it structurally evolves into a first level of relational structure. Next, let's look at the physical characteristic of light known as frequency. What the physical characteristic of light known as frequency is derived from at the level of relational structure is the rate at which the maximal distortion component of a second level relational structure is being fully propagated into the next adjacent reality cell in linear progression. And as previously stated, that rate will be relatively faster for relatively smaller reality cells and relatively slower for relatively larger reality cells. And that's because reality cell content that's being exchanged at an identical and constant speed between all reality cells just does not have as far to go to complete a full exchange of content when moving between relatively smaller reality cells, while conversely, that content simply has farther to go to complete a full exchange of content when moving between relatively larger reality cells. And so light that has a relatively longer wavelength is the physical etching of a maximal distortion component that is propagating through relatively larger reality cells, in which case it then takes relatively longer for that maximal distortion of reality cell content to be fully propagated into the next adjacent reality cell of the same size, thereby resulting in the physical observation that light that has a relatively longer wavelength has a relatively lower or slower frequency. Conversely, light that has a relatively shorter wavelength is the physical etching of a maximal distortion component that is propagating through relatively smaller reality cells, in which case those maximal distortions of reality cell content are fully propagated into the next adjacent reality cell of the same size relatively faster, thereby resulting in the physical observation that light that has a relatively shorter wavelength has a relatively higher or faster frequency. And so, the reason there is an inverse relation between the wavelength and frequency of light as a function of the speed of light constant, stated as frequency equals the speed of light divided by wavelength, is because reality cell content, whether distorted or uniform, is being continuously exchanged between adjacent reality cells of all sizes at the same speed. And that speed is the speed at which the fundamental reality is moving as it becomes relationally structured. And that speed is the speed of light. Put more accurately, the fundamental reality is always moving at the same non-physical speed. And at the physical level, that constant non-physical speed exists as the physical etching or appearance that we are aware of as the constant and unchanging speed of light. And as you will see, once the anatomy of third-level relational structures has been described, second-level relational structures never actually propagate from reality cell to reality cell at anything less than the speed of light. And so light never really travels at anything less than the speed of light. It's just that sometimes and under some circumstances that speed of light propagation is nonlinear, which then creates the appearance that what's there is propagating at a speed that is less than the speed of light, because it simply takes longer to get from point A to point B if you don't do so by moving in a straight line. Again, there was only one reality and one movement that is actually there where any physical reality appears to be. And that will become completely clear once the third level of relational structure has been described and related to the physical characteristics of matter. And so once again, as hard as it may be to comprehend or grasp, there is no physical frequency actually there where the frequency of light is observed to be. And that's because what's actually there where the physical characteristics of frequency only appears to be is a first level of relational structure that is composed of reality cells of different sizes that are all exchanging their content at the same speed, and so at different rates depending on their size. Now, another physical characteristic of light is the direct relation of its energy to its frequency through a physical constant known as Planck's constant, as expressed in the equation E equals hf, or energy equals Planck's constant multiplied by frequency. And if we understand that the equation E equals hf is a physical etching of the linearly propagating maximal distortion component of any second level relational structure, then we can further understand that Planck's constant, which is also referred to as the quantum of action, must represent some underlying factor that is constant with regard to those maximal distortion components, regardless of the size of the reality cells through which a particular maximal distortion component is propagating, because the equation E equals hf applies to all wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation and so applies to all sizes of reality cells through which a maximal distortion of reality cell content can propagate. And one underlying factor that is constant with regard to the maximal distortion component of second level relational structures, regardless of the size of the reality cells through which a particular maximal distortion component is propagating, is the speed at which a maximal distortion component propagates into an adjacent reality cell. However, that constant speed has already been accounted for and has been shown to correspond to the speed of light constant. Therefore, Planck's constant must represent some other underlying factor that is present with regard to the maximal distortion component of second level relational structures that also remains constant, regardless of the size of the reality cells through which a particular maximal distortion component is propagating. And the other underlying factor that is present and also remains constant, regardless of the size of the reality cells through which a maximal distortion component is propagating, is the maximal distortion itself. And that's because a maximal distortion of reality cell content is a self-relational movement of non-apparent reality that has a direction of movement that is the exact opposite of the direction of self-relational movement defined as reality cell content uniformity, and so is always the same, and so exists as a constant underlying non-physical factor regardless of the size of the reality cells through which that particular direction of self-relational movement is propagating. Put another way, the size of the reality cell through which a maximal distortion is propagating may be relatively larger or smaller, but the reality that's being propagated is always the same, because the reality that's being propagated is an intrinsic self-relational movement that always has the same direction. Therefore, what Planck's constant is a physical etching of is the intrinsic self-relational movement that has been defined as a maximal distortion of reality cell content, because that factor is the same and so is constant regardless of the size of the reality cells through which a maximal distortion component of any second level relational structure is propagating. There are numerous constants in physics, and in many cases, no one knows why those constants exist or what they represent. However, with regard to the speed of light constant and Planck's constant, it can now be understood that these two physical constants have as their basis unchanging and so constant features that are intrinsic to the relational structures that are actually there where physical reality appears to be. And so, as this graphic summarizes, we have now directly accounted for, at the level of relational structure, 4 of the 5 physical characteristics that are present in the 2 equations that describe the relations that exist between the physical characteristics associated with the physical reality that we refer to as light or electromagnetic radiation. The only physical characteristic of light present in those 2 equations that has yet to be directly accounted for at the level of relationally structured reality is the physical characteristic referred to as energy. And the physical characteristic referred to as energy has not been directly accounted for because, as the energy equation for light indicates, the physical reality that we perceive as the energy associated with light is not a function of a single factor, but is instead a physical characteristic that has as its underlying basis a relation that exists between 2 non-physical factors, one of which is constant and the other of which is variable. Specifically, what the equation energy equals Planck's constant multiplied by frequency states, when translated into terms that apply to relationally structured reality, is that the energy associated with a single quantum of light is a physical characteristic that has as its underlying basis a relation that exists between a maximal distortion of reality cell content and the frequency at which that maximal distortion of content propagates into the next adjacent reality cell. In the final analysis, the physical reality referred to as energy is just as much of an appearance as any other physical reality. That is, energy is not what is actually there where energy as a physical reality appears to be. Instead, what's actually there where any form of physical energy appears to be is some relative amount of the non-uniform or distorted self-relational movement of the fundamental reality. As that non-uniform or distorted self-relational movement is itself moving or propagating through the first level of relational structure, driven by the speed of light exchange of reality cell content that continuously occurs within the first level of relational structure. In terms of relationally structured reality, given a fixed and yet undefinable amount of self-relational movement taking place within the first level of relational structure, the maximal distortion of a higher frequency second level relational structure linearly propagates through more reality cells than the maximal distortion of a lower frequency second level relational structure. And that difference in how many reality cells the maximal distortion propagates through, given a fixed yet undefinable amount of self-relational movement taking place at the first level of relational structure, is the only difference of any significance that exists between second level relational structures that have different frequencies of content exchange. The speed at which the maximal distortion propagates, and so the distance the maximal distortion propagates, is the same for all second level relational structures, given any fixed yet undefinable amount of self-relational movement taking place at the first level of relational structure. And what is being propagated at that same speed and over that same distance is also the same, because in all cases, what is being propagated is intrinsic self-relational movement that has the same direction. And so the only significant difference there is between any two second-level relational structures that have different frequencies of content exchange is the difference in the number of reality cells that their maximal distortion components propagate through, given a fixed yet undefinable amount of self-relational movement taking place within the first level of relational structure. Therefore, it has to be that difference and that difference alone that is the non-physical basis underlying why different wavelengths of light are observed to have different amounts of energy. Again, energy is not what's actually there. Instead, energy is our physical etching of a particular relation that exists between certain aspects of the non-physical relational structures that are actually there. And in terms of those relational structures, what is actually taking place to produce the observation that different wavelengths of light have relatively more or less energy are maximal distortions of reality cell content propagating through relatively more or fewer reality cells when driven by a fixed yet undefinable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And as abstract and difficult to follow as this discussion of the non-physical basis of energy may be, the reason that is being explained is to make the point that no matter how fundamental the physical reality, what is actually there is not that physical reality. Instead, what is actually there, where any physical reality is observed to be, is the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, as that movement has become structured in some way through iterative and so progressive relation to itself. Put another way, what Einstein did with his E equal mc squared equation was demonstrate that matter is actually a form of energy. And what I'm doing, by relating physical characteristics to the features of a relationally structured non-physical reality, is demonstrating that what all physical realities have as their actual and underlying basis is some structured form of the speed of light movement of the fundamental and formless reality that we refer to as awareness. And so the first level of relational awareness structure is composed of the first way that the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality becomes stably structured. And second level relational awareness structures are composed of the second way the same movement of that same reality becomes stably structured once it exists as the first level of relational structure. And as will be described in the next or third video, third level relational awareness structures are composed of the third way the same movement of that same reality is able to become stably structured once it exists as the first two levels of relational structure. And then in the fourth video, I will describe the unique relation that the fundamental reality is able to form with itself to produce the fourth level of relational structure once it has structurally evolved into a third level of relational structure. And explaining all of that will establish the context that will make it possible to understand why our minds evolved as specialized fourth level relational structures that have the ability to produce two related sets of appearances that we then mistake for being realities that are actually there, thereby obscuring from our awareness the reality that is actually there, and which reality just happens to be the reality we really are, leaving us effectively trapped in mind-generated experiential environments where we suffer tremendously as we search in vain for something that seems to be missing but isn't really missing because it's only been obscured. Here's the big picture. Consider the formless and fundamental reality of awareness as analogous to an endless body of water. And then consider the first level of relational awareness structure as that water flowing as a river with no turbulence. And then eventually areas of slight turbulence arise in that flow, and those areas of slight turbulence are analogous to second level relational awareness structures. And then eventually some of those areas of slight turbulence come together and coalesce to form swirls, and those swirls are analogous to third level relational awareness structures. Now, if that pattern of progressive self-relation continued, next I would be telling you that those swirls then come together to produce some higher order form of turbulence that is analogous to fourth level relational awareness structures. But that's not what happens, because the relation that produces fourth level relational structures, which are the type of structure that is actually there, where living or animated matter appears to be, is a completely new and unique relation that the fundamental reality is only able to form with itself once it is functioning as the first three levels of relational structure. And in terms of this water analogy, the new and unique relation that the fundamental reality forms with itself in order to function as a fourth level of relational structure is analogous to some portion of the original and endless body of water being able to flow through those third level swirls, which are just relationally structured forms of itself, and in so doing, animating those swirls, which is to say, inducing additional motion in those swirls beyond the motion that is already an intrinsic part of their structure. But here's the thing, the individualized portions of the endless body of water that are flowing through and animating those swirls are not aware of any of that, because all they are aware of are physical etchings that the swirls they are animating are able to produce when those swirls basically run into other forms of turbulence that exist within the river. But the river itself is non-turbulent, so it produces no etching. And so to the individualized portions of the endless body of water that are flowing through and animating those swirls, the river appears like an empty nothingness in which various and seemingly separate physical forms appear. But those various physical forms are really just differently appearing etchings of different forms of turbulence that arise within the unseen river that's actually there, all of which are composed of the same indivisible and endless water reality. But again, the individualized portions of the endless body of water that are flowing through and animating those swirls are not aware of any of that, because all they are aware of are the physical etchings, because they all made the same unavoidable mistake. And that unavoidable mistake is believing those physical etchings to be realities that are actually there, thereby obscuring from their individual awarenesses the reality that is actually there, which is their own reality, and thereby leaving those individual awarenesses effectively trapped within a reality they believe to actually be there, even though that reality is nothing more than an etching of certain structural aspect of the reality that's both actually there and what they really are, which then leaves those individual awarenesses completely unaware that what's actually there and what's actually everywhere is their own indivisible reality flowing in relation to itself. And that, in a somewhat large nutshell, is the situation that you're in. Except you're not an endless body of water flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself. Instead, you're a beginningless, endless, and dimensionless awareness flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of yourself. And my goal is to make that as clear as possible so that you can begin to free yourself from the mind-generated experiential cage in which your individual flow of awareness is, in all likelihood, effectively trapping itself as a function of what is nothing more than a mistaken belief that you harbor and cling to regarding the nature of the mind-generated physical and mental experiential realities, mistakenly believing them to be realities that are both actually there and what you really are. Because all psychological suffering, and that's the worst kind of suffering there is, has as its basis the effective entrapment of an individualized flow of awareness within a mind-generated experiential environment where it remains completely unaware of its own reality and of what it actually is, leaving that awareness with no choice but to act in the world on the basis of what are ultimately completely delusional ideas regarding what both it and the universe are. And acting in that way tends to place our individualized flow of awareness in opposition to our larger non-individualized flow. And that produces the negative emotions that we experience and refer to as suffering. Because just like everything else that we experience as reality, what we experience as our emotional reality is not a random occurrence, but is a function of a relation that the reality that's both actually there and what we really are is able to become involved with itself as a result of flowing through and animating a structured form of itself. Long story short, when you direct your individualized flow of awareness or consciousness in a way that places it in alignment with your non-individualized flow, you create and experience a positive emotion. And when you direct your individualized flow of awareness or consciousness in a way that places it in opposition to your non-individualized flow, you create and experience a negative emotion. That's it. That's how simple emotional reality ultimately is, when it's understood in terms of the reality that's actually there, where physical reality only appears to be. You see, emotional reality, just like physical and mental reality, is supposed to provide us, as individualized flows of awareness, with information that we can use to sustain the fourth level relational awareness structures that we are flowing through and animating. And that's because the fourth level relational awareness structures that we are flowing through and animating evolved to function optimally when the direction of the individualized and animating flow of awareness aligns with the non individualized direction of flow of awareness that is functioning as those structures. And as individualized flows of awareness, which is to say, as individualized flow of the fundamental reality, we are free to choose an individual direction of flow that either aligns with or opposes our non individualized flow. That is the essence of free will. But as long as your awareness is effectively trapped in a mind generated experiential cage, your will is not really free because you don't even know that such a choice exists. Instead, while effectively trapped in our experiential cages, we tend to choose our individual direction of flow based on whatever delusional ideas we have regarding both ourselves and the world. And as often as not, or more often than not, the choice that we make places our individualized flow in opposition to our non individualized flow. And so we produce and experience a negative emotion. Now, what that negative emotion is trying to tell us is just, hey, you're not flowing yourself in the direction that the larger, non individualized, or more universal you is flowing. But we don't see it that way. And we can't see it that way because we have no awareness whatsoever of the relation with ourself in which we are involved in order to produce that negative emotion. Because we have no awareness whatsoever of what we really are or the situation that we're in. And so we don't make functional use of that negative emotional information by using it to change our individualized flow of awareness to a more aligned flow, which, if we did, would then cause us to create and experience a positive emotion instead. Instead, what we tend to do is make dysfunctional use of that negative emotional information by directing our awareness even more firmly in opposition to our unseen and yet true and non individualized self, in which case we then feel even worse. And we naturally and reflexively do that because it seems to us that we feel bad because of what's going on out there in the experiential world or because of what someone out there is doing. And so it seems to us that the way to feel better is by changing what's going on out there or what someone else is doing. And that can work for a few seconds, minutes, or hours until the next thing we don't like comes along, and then we feel bad all over again, leaving us working frantically, either externally or in our minds, to try to change it so we can feel better, never knowing that we can always feel better right now by simply choosing a different direction of internal and individualized flow. Because it is that direction of internal and individualized flow and how that individualized flow relates to your non individualized flow as either aligned or opposed that is 100% responsible for the emotional reality that you are experiencing in any given moment and nothing else, no matter how much it seems that some person, event, or circumstance is making you feel bad and leaving you with no choice but to feel bad. And that what I just said is true is not at all difficult to verify in your own experience. All you have to do to prove that your emotional reality is the result of a choice that you are making, either consciously or unconsciously, and not the direct cause and effect result of what is going on externally, is the next time some relatively insignificant unwanted event or circumstance occurs and you feel a negative emotion start to arise, recognize that you are internally opposing or pushing against that unwanted event or circumstance, and just stop doing that by instead choosing to accept the in the moment reality of that event or circumstance. You don't have to like it, you just have to accept that in that moment, that's the way it is, and recognize the complete and utter futility of pushing against it. The light's red, the line's not moving as fast as you want. These and dozens of other minor inconveniences that arise every day are opportunities for experimentation. And so just change your attitude towards some relatively insignificant unwanted event or circumstance from opposition to acceptance and see what happens to your emotional reality. That's all. If the external reality is the direct cause of your emotional reality, which most people tend to believe because that's what seems to be the case while operating from within an experiential delusion, then your emotional reality should not change because the event has not changed, because the light's still red or the line is not moving very fast still, or whatever. On the other hand, if your emotional reality changes at all by becoming less negative or even positive, then that can only be as a result of your change in attitude toward the unwanted event or circumstance because nothing else in that experiment changed. And any such change would then verify that your in the moment emotional reality is not primarily a function of external circumstances over which you have no control, but is instead a function of something that you have the ability to completely control. Once you are no longer fully and continuously caught up in an experiential dream that leaves you completely unaware of what's really going on beyond that dream to create what your individual awareness becomes conscious of as its emotional reality. We are in the matrix, people, but it's not a matrix that's being produced by some malevolent entity or machine. Instead, it's a matrix that's being produced by minds that we ourselves, as individualized aspects of the fundamental reality, are both animating and illuminating. In other words, what we really are is the formless and fundamental reality that's hidden behind the curtain of created experiential appearances that we are aware of and refer to as physical, mental, and emotional reality. And we have become effectively trapped within a reality made up of those created experiential appearances as a result of doing nothing more than mistakenly believing those created appearances to be realities that are actually there, where our own reality actually is. And so all you have to do to begin to free your individual flow of awareness from the mind-generated experiential matrix in which it is, in all likelihood, effectively trapping itself, is change what you believe about the nature of the experiential appearances from a completely inaccurate belief to a more accurate belief, so that you are no longer completely and continuously obscuring the formless and fundamental reality that's both actually there and what you really are from your awareness. And the reason I use the phrase effectively trapped rather than just trapped when describing the situation in which we have placed ourselves is because the reality that we really are is everywhere, and so can't actually be trapped anywhere. It's just that when an individualized portion of that indivisible reality becomes mistakenly aware of what are only created appearances as realities that are actually there, a limiting condition is produced that prevents that individualized portion of the formless and fundamental reality, which is still everywhere and everything, from becoming aware of itself, so that the only realities that individualized portion of the fundamental reality remains aware of are the same created appearances that it is using to produce the limiting condition that is keeping it hidden from itself. And as a result, that individualized awareness becomes effectively trapped in that limiting condition and in the reality of misconceived appearances that it is using to create that limiting condition, even though the reality that it really is remains everywhere and is not actually trapped anywhere. And that's why experiential reality is just a sort of dream that the reality that we really are is dreaming. And as that fundamental reality, you can be asleep in that experiential dream and know it as what is real and is all that is real, in which case that then all seems so very serious and absolutely important and isn't really all that enjoyable, except for brief moments of enjoyment here and there scattered amongst the suffering. On the other hand, you can be awake in that experiential dream and know it as just a sort of dream, in which case it no longer seems so very serious and absolutely important, and then it becomes much more enjoyable, except perhaps for brief moments of suffering scattered amongst the enjoyment. The reality that you really are came here to become aware of itself and enjoy itself in the process. Now, what does that mean? Enjoy itself. It means that in coming here and animating these bodies, which are relationally structured forms of our true and formless self, we enveloped ourselves and so surrounded ourselves with our own joy, because the reality of joy is not separate from what we really are. We ourselves, as we really are the joy, the nirvana, and the kingdom of heaven that we endlessly seek, but never really find because we're looking in all the wrong places. And so, surrounding ourselves with our own beingness, with our own joy, is exactly what we are doing here as we flow through and animate these relationally structured forms of ourself. But if that's the case, then where the fuck is the joy? It's not here. It's not here. Maybe it's over there. It's not, but feel free to look anyway, because you may find some pale imitation of it here or there, in which case you may then spend much of your life chasing after more of the thing that you think can give it to you, but never really does, at least for very long. And it's not here or over there, because the thing that you're really looking for does not exist in experiential reality, because the thing that you're really looking for is not an experiential reality, but is the non-experiential reality that is both creating and aware of experiential reality. And that non experiential reality is always right here and is always everywhere, hiding from itself behind the obscuring veil of experiential reality that it is itself creating and then mistaking for what's actually there, thereby obscuring itself from itself so that it ends up looking for itself in the one place it can never be found. No wonder the Buddha is laughing, because it's a comic farce of cosmic proportions. Although it certainly doesn't seem that way when you're completely and effectively trapped in it, and so see no way out of the suffering that being effectively trapped in it always produces. And speaking of Buddhas, I'm going to bring this video to a close the same way I will probably end every video, and that is by referring you to Eckhart Tolle, because you do not need a detailed understanding of the nature of reality in order to become directly aware of the reality that you really are. And that is the main event. Understanding the nature of reality can facilitate that event, but such a conceptual understanding is by no means absolutely necessary. All that is absolutely necessary is that you want to do so and then make the effort to do so, although it's not really an effort because it's quite natural. The real effort is in doing everything else other than that. In any case, Tolle can show you how easy it is to become directly aware of the reality that you really are, beyond whatever mind-generated image of yourself you presently occupy and are effectively trapped within. Because the purpose of pretty much every one of his talks is to direct the listener's attention and soul awareness toward the formless and fundamental reality that lies beyond mind-generated reality. And so once again, I'll post a link to a couple of his YouTube videos below this video. You might as well give it a try, because whether you know it or not, that's the thing you're really looking for, because that's the thing that's actually gone missing. And unless and until you become aware of that thing that's not a thing, you will suffer, but not as some sort of punishment for making what is ultimately an unavoidable mistake, but simply because suffering is what the formless awareness that you really are cannot help but create and become aware of when you inadvertently direct your individualized awareness in opposition to your non-individualized and universal awareness. It is not in our nature to flow or move in opposition to ourself. It is in our nature to flow in alignment with ourself. But when we completely lose sight of our nature and what we really are, and instead come to know ourselves as being what are ultimately only mind-generated physical and mental realities, it then becomes quite natural for us to do something that is otherwise completely unnatural. It's not natural to pick up a pointed stick and start jabbing your arm with it, because that causes physical pain, and we naturally don't like or want pain. But if you somehow became completely convinced that your arm was a snake that was trying to bite you, then while operating under that delusion, you would in all likelihood begin to do that which is completely unnatural, and begin attacking and poking what you believe to be a snake, even though it would remain your own arm. And so it would hurt. But because the pain you would actually be causing yourself would be experienced in the context of the delusion in which you're operating, you would not see the pain as being something that you were causing. Instead, you would see the cause of the pain as a snake biting you, causing you to jab at it even harder, thereby causing even more pain, and thereby causing you to jab at it harder still, and on it would go. And that is essentially the present day human condition, except the suffering that we are causing ourselves is primarily of the emotional and psychological variety. And that variety of suffering comes from habitually and chronically flowing our individual awarenesses in opposition to what is ultimately our own reality or self, as a result of not recognizing that the entire universe and everything in it beyond the physical surface appearance is composed of the reality that we really are, and so is ultimately and truly ourself. And we do not recognize that simple fact because we are caught up in the mind-generated physical and mental surface appearances, completely unaware of the reality that's both actually there and what we really are. And that then presents us with the appearance, and so has us believing that we live in a universe that's composed of truly separate, indivisible physical and mental realities, some of which we identify with and so consider to be self, and others of which we do not identify with and so consider to be not self or other. And those realities that we consider to be not self or other, we tend to see as things that need to be opposed and jabbed at, because we are afraid they either might bite us or get in the way of our finding what it is that we seem to have lost. It always comes back to the fact of the situation that we are in, in that situation is that the reality that is both actually there and what we really are is being continuously obscured from our individual awarenesses as a function of what is nothing more than a mistaken belief that we harbor and cling to regarding the nature of what are only mind generated experiential appearances, thereby conferring upon those appearances a level of reality and actuality that only we ourselves, as the fundamental reality, only ever truly possess. And we suffer tremendously as a result, but we don't have to. We can wake up from the experiential dream while still in the dream. There is no cosmic law or rule that says just because human beings have been effectively trapped in a mind generated dream for thousands of years that we have to remain there. But no one can wake up for you. You have to choose to do so yourself because you are the fundamental reality, and so there is no force in the universe or beyond that can really make you do anything. And so you choose to stay asleep or you choose to wake up. And either way, you remain the same timeless and formless reality that you have always been. The only difference is whether or not you will individually enjoy the process of enjoyment that the reality that you really are is engaged in. And with that, I will bid you adieu. Until the next time, namaste.
People are queer, they're always crowing, scrambling and rushing about. Why don't they stop someday, address themselves this way? Why are we here? Where are we going? It's time that we found out. We're not here to stay, we're on a short holiday. Life is just a bowl of cherries. Don't take it serious, it's too mysterious. You work, you save, you worry so, but you can't take your dough when you go, go, go. So keep repeating it's the berries. The strongest oak must fall. The sweet things in life to you were just loaned. So how can you lose what you've never owned? Life is just a bowl of cherries. So live and laugh at it all.